less than 24 hours, and it's not what any of the people who were fighting about this before, any of the pundits at least, were saying was going to happen.
Yeah, the headline writers who were setting up their Democrats in disarray headlines now have to go somewhere else. But there's a tremendous suspense and what I'm sure will be excitement in the question of vice presidential nomination. That's to come.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Well, when I was in high school, Boston Globe columnist George Fraser said he never wanted to meet politicians because he was afraid he might like them. And then he wouldn't be objective in writing about them. And I knew when I was in high school and I read that column, I knew George Fraser was right when I read that. George Fraser was an elegant prose stylist and sometimes profound thinker who grew up in a Boston Irish neighborhood like mine, went to public school, and made his way to Harvard College, where he followed the advice of poet laureate Robert Frost, the advice that Robert Frost gave to John Kennedy, which was, quote, "Be more Irish than Harvard." I knew Robert Frost was right, too, when I read that. What he was saying was, empathy is more valuable than expertise, because empathy cannot be taught in classrooms. George Fraser was right to believe that he wasn't strong enough to suppress his empathy for those three Kennedy brother politicians that he was covering in those days in the Boston Globe, if he had gotten to know them well. Many reporters were not as strict as George Fraser about keeping their distance from politicians. The legendary anchorman of the era, Walter Cronkite, befriended John Fitzgerald Kennedy and had to fight back tears on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, when Walter Cronkite made this announcement to the nation.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded.
Joe Biden was 21 years old on that day, eagerly awaiting the chance to vote for the very first time in his life in the next presidential election, when he was supposed to get to cast his first vote for the re-election of John F. Kennedy, the first president who was just like him, Catholic and Irish American. Joe Biden didn't need a world-renowned poet to remind him of the importance of empathy, which I discovered very quickly about Joe Biden when I was working for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the United States Senate in the 1990s, and I got to know and work with Joe Biden. It never occurred to me then that there would come a time when I would be working in a news organization covering Joe Biden, especially since this news organization, MSNBC, didn't even exist at the time. When I got into this line of work, it was too late for me to observe George Fraser's rule of not meeting politicians. My very first guest on this program 13 years ago was my friend, the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
You and I had a mutual friend, Pat Moynihan. When you were running his show and I was his colleague, a majority in the Senate used to mean 51 votes. Since we've gotten elected, Barack Obama and Joe Biden, there's a new majority in the Senate, 60 votes. What the president's been able to do has been truly remarkable with the help of a Democratic Congress. And so those who didn't get everything they wanted, it's time to just buck up here, understand that we can make things better, continue to move forward, but not yield the playing field to those folks who are against everything that we stand for in terms of the initiatives we put forward.
You know, I didn't think of myself as running Pat Moynihan's show. Liz Moynihan ran Pat Moynihan's show, as you can remember.
That's true.
Imagine if President Joe Biden had 60 Democrats in the Senate. What he did with 50 was a political miracle that I did not think was possible. I marveled watching Joe Biden as president manage legislation that, in my legislating experience, simply could not be done without a big Democratic majority in the Senate. Wherever you rank Joe Biden in legislative achievements by presidents, if you factor in degree of difficulty, because he only had 51 votes in the Senate, including the vice president, then Joe Biden moves right up to number one. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had massive Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate to enact Social Security and so many other important advances in the way we live. Lyndon Johnson had massive Democratic majorities in the Senate and the House when he passed what would otherwise have been difficult legislation. None of those previous presidents could possibly have accomplished what Joe Biden accomplished with such a narrow majority, and none of them would have understood the budget rules of the Senate, because there were no budget rules of the Senate and no budget committees during the Roosevelt era or even during Lyndon Johnson's time. In the last few weeks, when Joe Biden watched, surely with some degree of shock, as friends of his turned against him and then spoke against him or offered forums for others to speak against him, I was not one of them. I knew that many of those people found it very painful to urge Joe Biden to step down, and that many of them were doing all of that for what they firmly believed was the good of the country. I just didn't read the polling evidence the same way that they did. And I definitely believed that it was still very possible for Joe Biden to win, as I now believe that Kamala Harris is probably on her way to winning. I am not a big believer in risk-taking in politics, and so it seemed to me that the best option was to stick with Joe Biden. And the only person who could convince me otherwise would have to be Joe Biden. Not because I had violated the George Fraser rule and gotten to know Joe Biden too well. It was because I knew his work too well. I knew the degree of difficulty that he had overcome. I knew how masterfully he united the NATO alliance to resist Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. And I knew how he kept winning seemingly impossible legislative victories. And I knew that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in much worse condition than Joe Biden. In FDR's re-election campaign in the middle of World War II, while he was secretly developing an atomic bomb and serving as the greatest commander-in-chief in American war history. Franklin Roosevelt was in rapidly failing health then, on his way to dying, 82 days after Inauguration Day, and still doing the job of the presidency better than anyone had ever done it. And I knew, and publicly insisted for many, many years, that so-called presidential debates have absolutely nothing to do with the real job of the president. So I wasn't panicked by Joe Biden's senior moments in the so-called debate, especially when he gave a very strong campaign speech the very next day, which much of the media ignored. And then I watched President Biden give the best televised presidential press conference on foreign policy in history after the NATO summit. That was the most challenging televised cognitive test you could ever want to see. I said repeatedly on this program that we were covering the campaign one day at a time and ignoring the guessing games about what was going to happen tomorrow. And so today, Vice President Kamala Harris is now the new Democratic candidate for president, well on her way to her party's nomination in place of Joe Biden. Today, at campaign headquarters in Delaware, the vice president's husband became the first person to introduce the new presidential candidate.
We have an amazing team. You have done an amazing job, and you're going to continue to do that so we can elect Kamala Harris as the next president of the United States of America. So let's hear it for Kamala Harris. Thank you.
He got to be the first to say, the next president of the United States of America, Kamala Harris. President Biden, still recovering from COVID, made his first public comments by phone to his former campaign workers before Kamala Harris spoke to them. Those campaign workers who are now all Harris campaign workers.
Julie, if I didn't have COVID, I'd be sitting there with you, standing there with you. I'm so proud of what you've all done. But this COVID has been keeping me out of people's hair for the next 3 or 4 days. But I'm going to be on the road, and I'm not going anywhere. It's kept me away a little bit. But, you know, I want people to remember that what we have done has been incredible, and we get so much more we're going to get done. And so I want to say hello to Kamala, if she can hear me. I know she's going to be speaking shortly. And I want to say to the team, embrace her. She's the best. I want to call today to thank everybody in this effort. I know yesterday's news was surprising, and it's hard for you to hear, but it was the right thing to do. I know it's hard because you poured your heart and soul into me to help us win this thing, help me get this nomination, help me win the nomination, and then go on to win the presidency. But, you know, you're an amazing team, but we've got a great, I think we made the right decision. I know how hard you've worked, how many sacrifices you've made, and so many of you uprooted your lives for me, and the kind of commitment few people make for anything these days, but you made it. And I've been honored and humbled. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. My word is a Biden, that for all you've done for me and my family. And we built the best campaign in organization in history. I've been doing this, I always kid and say, I know I'm only 40, but I've been around a long time. I don't know of a better campaign organization, grassroots campaign. You know, we have over 230 offices opened. We have over 2,000 paid staff. And we have literally several thousand volunteers on a regular basis, thousands of them. And they've been relentless and tireless in reaching out and contacting voters. The leadership of this campaign has been amazing. Jen O'Malley Dillon, Julie Quinn, Michael Tyler, Rob Flaherty, Rufus on raising money, and so many more. You built this team, you brought them together, you brought us together, you've inspired them, and you've done what leaders do.
And the New York Times is reporting at this moment that Kamala Harris has secured the backing of a majority of the delegates needed to win the Democratic nomination for president. Those 230 campaign offices that you just heard Joe Biden talking about and the thousands of staff are now working in service to the Harris for President campaign.
I've got 6 months left in my presidency. I'm determined to get as much done as I possibly can, both foreign policy and domestic policy. Keep lowering costs for families, continue to speak out on guns and child care, elder care, prescription drugs, and climate. Climate still is the existential threat that we face, and if we don't win this thing, it's all in jeopardy. And we got to keep working for an end to the war in Gaza. I'll be working very closely with the Israelis and with the Palestinians to try to work out how we can get the Gaza war to end and Middle East peace and get all those hostages home. I think we're on a